today. We've had a wide variety of presentations, and we're delighted now to introduce the participants of a panel discussion. The title of the panel discussion is South Africa, a Logistics Quagmire Question. Put a bit of background noise there, but that's okay. Hopefully we won't mute or let the speakers mute themselves unnecessarily. We'll start off, and I will introduce the panelists, and then Martin will handle the panel discussion, and Tanya will close off when we get to the end. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Martin Bailey, a good friend to SAPIX and an awesome supporter. Martin is a professional engineer with a bachelor's and master's degree. He started his working career at Coca-Cola and then as a senior lecturer at WITS. 34 years ago, he co-founded ILS, the leading South African consulting company focusing on building warehouses and distribution networks. Martin has been responsible for developing over 500 warehouse facilities throughout the world. He's best known for his pragmatic approach to developing practical solutions to business needs across the supply chain, and he's great to have on a panel and speaking at SAPIX events. We're joined by Gavin Kelly, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Road Freight Association. Gavin is also a good friend of SAPIX, and we're grateful to him for his time. His objective is to be a task-driven team leader, and he works in situational leadership interspersed with functional leadership modes, which I like very much. He has been at WITS, UNISA, Northwest University, and University of Pretoria over his time. And we welcome a new friend to SAPIX, Sandra, who is a consultant with the Freight Intermodal Systems in South Africa, and she was the ex-manager in business strategy and planning at Transnet. So thank you to the three of you for your support of SAPIX and giving up some time this afternoon to discuss this interesting topic. And I hand over to you, Martin. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Am I audible?
Yep, can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to share a screen with you quickly. I'm just going to go through a couple of slides just as an introduction. Can you all see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet, but it's coming, I'm sure. We can see all your certificates.
Yes.
Oh, that's me behind. That's not the screen. Entire screen share. Oh.
It's okay. It does take a bit of time to learn this platform.
Okay, I'm hitting the share button, but it doesn't want to allow me to share.
Okay. Can our technical team from behind give some assistance?
Let me try again.
Okay.
Okay, present your screen. Share now.
Do you want? Okay. Okay. Cindy, can you remember what you did last evening with Cindy? Otherwise, you can email them to me, and we can do it.
Or we can do the presentation later in the talk.
Okay. If you've got a gap, you can email it to me, and then we can share it for you.
I will email it to you right now. Okay.
Sure. Great.
Great. So we're sort of going to take you through some of the problems in the South African environment. What's happening in South Africa, railways collapsing, Eskom collapsing, roads getting more and more congested, and Gavin can talk to you about one or two of the problems he has of trucks being set alight along the freeways, the international supply chain falling apart, the ports struggling, just about anything you can think of in the supply chain is struggling a little bit. And with that, it's an interesting environment to chat about. And we really want to do this as a participation thing. So as many of you guys ask questions and participate, this is a panel discussion. This is not a something where, we lecture you. So, you've got some people who've done this for a few years. I've been doing this for close to 40 years. Gavin and Sandra, probably not nearly as long. So, guys, we'd like you to come up, tell us anything you would like to do and where you want to go and what you want to talk about. Gavin, do you want to just tell them a little bit about some of the issues you're having?
Sure, Martin.
Right.
Not a problem. I think let me jump in. Land transport is always seen to be the safe transport to use. You hear of terrible stories happening on the sea and in the air, and they seem to be quite dramatic. But over the last couple of years, we've started to face a serious number of challenges, and they seem to be multiplying right now. And if I just think of them sort of the top of my head, we have challenges in the ports, and the ports have almost three sets of challenges. And the first challenge seems to be weather-bound. I don't know if our forefathers decided to build the ports where the winds were the strongest, and I suppose they must have, because sailing ships were the means of transporting across the sea. But quite often you'll hear, if you're in the business, that the port is wind-bound. And I always wondered what was wind-bound. But if the wind's blowing in the wrong direction, that actually can be quite dangerous for the ships moving in and out of the port. And then there are other issues around that, around high and low tides. And of course, you'll all recall the weather we had down in KZN when the Port of Natal, Port of Durban, and the surrounding areas were actually hit quite hard. And that short period, which we all seem to have already forgotten about, but that short period into our sector of the economy cost us about 310 million rand. And that was just over that period of logistics being sort of throttled and not being able to move. There's, of course, a whole lot of other costs that are going to come into that. So ports, in terms of weather, are a problem. In terms of being in the right place at the right time, we've got tremendous competition coming from the ports around us. And if our ports aren't operating optimally and really moving cargo, our ports start to stagnate because they don't get ships through. And then finally, it's around the whole access to our ports. We still struggle to this day to actually get goods in and out of our major ports. And think about the Port of Durban, how often you've heard about the truck queues and guys standing there for hours and hours. So that's a huge issue for us. The land borders. I mean, COVID taught us a couple of things. And I just came off a whole discussion this morning where we are discussing things around the automation, the AI role in terms of moving things across countries' borders and what have you. But the physicality of borders is going to be, going forward, replaced a lot more by electronic moves. Yes, you'll still have the physical border, I suppose, until the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and that area comes to play. But a lot of challenges around borders about guys standing there for hours and around the criminality to that. And that's, I suppose, what Martin wanted me to talk about. In the last decade, but with heightened focus over the last 5 years, we've seen logistics chains being targeted. Still fresh in our memories is what happened in July last year. That was something absolutely off the charts for us. We now are finding that people will have unhappiness and misunderstandings or really huge issues that have got nothing to do with the supply chain sector, the logistics sector at all. And this was ostensibly driven through political issues, but all of a sudden we found ourselves in the middle, literally, of a war zone. Trucks were attacked, warehouses were attacked. There's some of those warehouses that right now have not been repaired. They need to be broken down and rebuilt from scratch. A lot of the cold chain warehouses were destroyed. And maybe on the one hand, people say we can get more modern equipment in, but the devastation and the knock-on effect is something we haven't seen, I think, only in movies. You see these catastrophic movies where things are wiped out. So those sorts of things have become a real issue for us in South Africa with road freight transport being targeted. Trucks are slow. There are areas where they gather. Toll gates is one of them. Overnight stops is another. Interestingly enough, mountain passes where they have to drive slower. They get targeted, and the level of violence, in actual fact, is quite frightening. And then just finally, electricity affects everyone, and it affects us. At the point of loading, at the point of offloading, trying to get into retail stores. If any sort of cargo has any sort of either health-related temperature control or has high security value or is a high-value good and has high security structures in place, as soon as that electricity disappears, a lot of that is critical in the supply chain collapses, and suddenly the trucks become mobile warehouses. They've got generators on them. They have to keep everything going. But more importantly, those trucks either can't load or can't offload, and that whole cycle of those trucks moving around is now broken, and that supply chain begins to clog. In terms of riots and delays, over the last year, including the July incident, we've lost 9 billion rand, and that's big money, especially within and after the COVID pandemic and what COVID is still doing into the sector. It's really, really big money. And if we want to compete with the world, we've got to find solutions for this. And rail needs to play its part. Nobody, definitely not the Road Freight Association, has said that rail shouldn't be around. It shouldn't be playing its part. 88% of goods traveling by road, that's not something that we could, with the best of intentions, sustain for a lengthy period. Martin, is that giving you a chance to find your slideshow?
Well, I have emailed it, so I don't know if they've got it. But yeah, that's amazing. That's fantastic.
May I just comment
you
there
go.
as well? I think some of what you started to say, Martin, and also what Gavin has highlighted. And perhaps we should start to ask ourselves, what have we learned from the last 5 years, and more particularly the last 2 years, where everything that's happened has illustrated to us where all the weaknesses are in our supply chains. So how resilient are our supply chains, and where are the alternatives? We've seen the issues that farmers, the agri-sector has had in trying to export the citrus and all sorts of fruit, often losing out and having to just bring it back and make juice or whatever. So we can moan and groan like we do, like South Africans do, but what can we do about it? What can we do now that we have identified so many of those weaknesses? What can we do to address those imbalances in the system, to really get stuck into the weaknesses and find ways to work together and address some of those weaknesses, make the supply chains more cost effective, more efficient, more resilient?
Magic. Can we push those slides up? Let's show them for a few seconds, because it couples right in what you both have said. While you're putting those up, I think the one thing I'll emphasize is just how isolated South Africa is from the rest of the world. We really are an isolated place. We're not only isolated from the rest of the world in terms of our geographical location, our economic hub, although people in Cape Town might argue, our economic hub is in Joburg. And that is isolated from the South African coastal and all our ports. So if you want to be competitive, somehow you got to get this isolation, you got to overcome the isolation. Tanya, can we show these slides?
So the slides are here. Can we get them up? Our
Yes,
technical team in the background have them. Hopefully they should pop up any moment now.
Okay, no problem. So besides being terribly isolated, on top of that, and I'll talk about it a bit, we have a Transnet freight rail, which is really in serious problem. Something like 30% of their rolling stock is standing in yards somewhere, which they can't repair because they had a fight with the guys who give them their spares, or they just don't have enough technicians to repair them. Who knows? Every time you hear a different story. So they haven't got enough wagons. They can't seem to schedule it. And on top of that, I'll show you some statistics just now on how many kilometers of copper has been stolen, especially during COVID. Now, there is a way to stop the stealing of copper. It's quite simple. You do exactly like you've done with gold, and you ban the sale of copper nationally. Boom. And you take out all your copper theft. Well, at least 90% of it. You'll always have something. But politically, I guess nobody wants to do that. So, you can't get a train to Durban anymore. We have one client who runs 2 train loads a day to Durban, equivalent, and now does 100% by truck, which is very good for some of the trucking companies, but not good for the country to be sending equivalent of 2 full 50 wagon trains to Durban every day by truck. Just is not viable. So that's some of the problems. Just now we can talk about some of the solutions and how we go about solving all that. I see slides. Tanya, can we put those up? Great. Okay, so what I want to just say is, how do we thrive in this diversity? Next slide. And as I said, we really are isolated. If you look at the map of the world and you look at South Africa, we're all man and woman alone in that far corner of the world. Next. And we're far from the ports. Cape Town, pretty far from Joburg, and Joburg is the economic hub of the country. 1,400 Ks, and these are car speeds. Truck speeds, of course, probably half of this. And far from Durban. If you look at Port Elizabeth as well, on the next slide, also quite far. So there was a plan to develop Kucha, get it going. It never really happened. The biggest advantage of Kucha is that we can get goods to Joburg without going through the Drakensberg, which means in theory, we can pull longer trains. The problem is there are something like 7 different types of wagons, locos that are needed, to move between Gqeberha and Joburg, because we've got different voltages, different electricity types. Some of them are diesel and so on. So, maybe Namibia, with all the borders gone, their Walvis Bay port seems to be operating quite well, although it's still quite small, but it's darn far away. And a lot of guys are using Mozambique. They're saying, we just can't put up with Durban anymore. Let's go to Mozambique. Next. And if you look here, some statistics at Transnet Freight Rail, percent of total freight by payload, and you can see what's happening to it. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. And the worst part is there's no light at the end of this tunnel. Nothing seems to indicate that Transnet Freight Rail are going to get their act together. So, we just hope. Look, on the other hand, on the bulk transport, they've more or less got it tapped. They are having problems. The bulk guys are saying they want to ship more, they want to export more coal, they want to export more iron ore, they want to export more manganese, and they just can't handle anymore. And Richards Bay has reached its limit. So, but generally, that part of the world works quite well. Next.
And obviously, the developments in terms of third-party access to the rail network could potentially make a significant improvement in the utilization of the rail network that exists, that the country's installed, that's been running well for more than 100 years. So I think there's a need for changing the way we think and looking at it about how do we make a competitive rail industry for the country, not about Transnet or Transnet Freight Rail getting their act together. It's about the country building a competitive rail industry. And perhaps Transnet Freight Rail in the future may be one of the players that will be the infrastructure owner. But I believe that there's many structural interventions underway that are going to change the way this rail system works. And then we need to support that.
Yeah, so I'm one of these extreme capitalist individuals that believes government should have no say in running of the railway lines. And until you privatize them, you're dead in the water. But that may not be a politically or a viable opinion. But yeah, let's just look at some of the issues at Transnet Freight Rail. Next slide. So they have 300 locos, according to Transnet, awaiting repairs, and they've lost 25% of their fleet. This is what they've published. Now, I've got 49 locos shown here, so take 300. So they've dropped, and they haven't got enough locos. Besides not having the electricity, they haven't got enough locos to pull the trains. Next. 1,000 kilometers of copper cable, that's this last financial year, 2022, has been stolen to date in the financial year. 1,000 kilometers of copper cable used. Okay, so how are you going to run your locos? There are options. One of the options, we do quite a lot of work in the mining industry, and they're all switching to aluminium cables. I predict that in 10 years, there won't be any copper cables left. Everybody will be on aluminium cables. Got its disadvantages, but at least they don't get stolen. Next. So when I first came into this industry, and I'd hate to tell you how many years ago, but it was sort of close to 30 years ago, we were already talking about creating an inland port in Johannesburg. Then they came up with Tambo Springs about 25 years ago, sort of formalized it 20 years ago, but it still hasn't been built. And the whole theory is we need to have a facility that's the other side of the PRASA lines. And that's why it's sort of out towards Vereeniging and Tambo Springs. This is where they want to build the national hub, or somewhere around there, so the trains don't have to come in and cross all the PRASA lines. And it makes a great deal of sense, but somebody's got to blow a couple of billion rand to make this thing work. Next. That's in Joburg, a port. And then I just saw a video this last week of version 200 of this. They keep coming up with a new idea of how, this is quite an old drawing, how they're going to upgrade the port. But again, nobody's got the money or the political will to do this. So a lot of strategic plans for the port, a lot of thoughts, a lot of really nice designs to upgrade the port. So they are now starting to talk about looking for partnerships, PPPs in the port. Next. please interrupt me, guys, as you go along. So Transnet's struggling. Does that mean more trucks? More warehouses in KZN? Because if you're trucking stuff to KZN, you might need a warehouse there before it goes into the port for more buffer. And as Gavin said, there's a bit of a shortage of warehouses at the moment because, firstly, there isn't land because of the shape of KZN. And secondly, quite a few of them got burnt and broken. Next. And then Gavin's favorite pastime to chat about is these trucks that keep getting burnt along the N2. That's a real problem with a mafia operating along there, and Gavin a lot more about it. Next. But it doesn't always work. This was the largest fire in South Africa that happened in Durban. 250,000 square meter building that burnt down. The good part for my company is we get to build this new warehouse to replace it. But yeah, it doesn't all work that you can just put up a shed wherever you want and hope for the best. Next. And of course, the riots, which Gavin talked about. Didn't help the whole system. And a lot of guys are saying, I don't want to build a new warehouse in those. The customer, he's saying, shit, I'm not building another warehouse. It's burnt down, it's buggered. I'm disinvesting out of Durban in case this happens again. Next. So the Department of Transport's had a few strategic plans. You guys can talk about them as well. Lots of them. Okay. But they ain't got the resources to implement them. But they're very good at creating strategic plans. Next. We just don't have the money to do them. And they don't have the money because we're taxed at the rate of most Western countries. And they really can't push our tax any higher. There you can see our marginal income tax rates compared to the rest of the world. So we're taxed at Western sort of European rates, but there just isn't potential to tax us anymore to get any more money to do all these upgrades. Next. Of course, inflation going up, we know that. They're talking in UK 15%, plus 10% in America. It's got to hit us soon. One suspects we'll be at the 12 to 15% within a year. Next. So, sorry, I'm depressing you all. And then there's a worldwide supply chain, which is just a mess. Who knows? Every time you ask somebody why it's happening, not enough supplies, not enough containers, not enough transport, not enough workers, not enough stuff in storage, so on and so on. But there is a worldwide issue. And let me give you an example. Next slide. When we try and automate facilities, they're now talking to us 18 months to the supply of process controllers. It's now taking longer to get the process controllers than it is to build a building. We can build a building and be ready to go in 12 to 14 months, but we can't get chips in under 18 months. So that supply chain has become a nightmare. Lots of reasons why. I mean, it's nothing to do with us back home here, but it is a worldwide issue. Thanks. Spot gas prices going through the roof. They've come down a bit, but we're well over $100 a barrel. We all know when we fill up what it costs. And for the trucking industry, and notice petrol came down quite a bit, but not so much diesel. Maybe Gavin, you want to tell us why just now? Next one. And of course the electric, although in a lot of the bigger industry, they can cope with electrical problems. It costs big money, but they put in bigger generators. We can put in solar panels on the roof. So if you're it's the small and medium enterprises that get hit the hardest without electricity. Next. And is there a light at the end of that tunnel? We're not seeing it at the moment. But hopefully there will be. I don't know what it is. Is it nuclear? Is it solar? Is it wind? Is it private companies coming on board? And so on. Next. So I've depressed you, but let's talk about some good stuff. We still have the prettiest country in the world. It's certainly the most interesting country to go anywhere in the world. I see a whole lot of thumbs coming up. Next. We've got probably the best banking system around. I don't know if any of you have tried banking in America or in UK. It's a nightmare. Our banks are just streets ahead of them. So we have that. Next. We've certainly got the best rugby team in the world. You can argue about that. Next one. E-commerce, I mean, if you look at some of the Checkers 60/60, Woolies Dash, Pick n Pay, Discount, take a lot. Brilliant. They're as good as anywhere in the world. And you can buy anything today online, get good service, large selection. That all works. Next one, good couriers and transport guys. Lots of guys who do really good job. There's no problem in sending anything anywhere pretty efficiently. So that all works. Next. This is DSV's latest courier facility. World class. So there are lots of world-class facilities scattered throughout South Africa. Next slide. Lots of world-class transport companies. Don't ask me why I chose this one, but just looked like a pretty truck. Next slide. And air freight. You want air freight around, you can get it. By 10 o'clock tonight, it will be delivered anywhere by 8 o'clock the next morning. Sorry, Gavin, this is not your road freight, but it is.
Truck got it there.
Yeah. Next slide. So we have some interesting future discussions. What's our world going to be like? Trucks going to need drivers? Warehouse going to need workers? Is our rail system going to need? Who knows? Maybe we'll just all buy 3D printers and print everything at home, and we won't need a supply chain. Okay, that's all I've got on slides.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of food for thought there, Martin. Thanks a lot. You said I was going to explain why diesel price didn't go down as largely or with such the same factor as petrol. It's really supply and demand, and around the world there's a huge demand for diesel, and there is a bit of a shortage in diesel supply because there's such a huge demand. Diesel around the world is used for a lot of power generation. You'll recall that when we have issues in South Africa, that I think Eskom calls it an open turbine generating station or something along those lines, where they burn diesel. And there are lots of countries around the world that use diesel to fuel and to provide heat, basic heating. And then there's a lot of industries. For example, the shipping industry uses what they call bunker fuels, but it's really a rather thick, nasty, sludgy form of diesel or fuel. So it's really demand. And because people are demanding it, they will pay a price, and I don't have to drop the price because I can sell it. And that's really what's at the bottom line in terms of why diesel hasn't decreased. It is in demand. Another piece of bad news. We're hoping that there will be a bit more movement in the coming months. Sorry, Martin.
Can you guys talk about these guys who burn your trucks on the freeway, or is that all stuff you don't want to talk about?
No, not at all. I mean, it's an open discussion. I think everybody is quite aware of what the root cause is, and we knew that a good 4 or 5 years ago. The minister and I had a bit of a tete-a-tete about whether it was 4 or 5 years ago, but it is about 5 years ago when the first burnings happened, and they probably didn't receive such huge media coverage then. But the burning of the trucks essentially is around the employment of foreigners in our sector, foreign drivers specifically in our sector. And those who felt that their voices weren't being heard, and that the government and their various government departments in this, and the two that you will read about quite a bit in the media is the Department of Home Affairs that deals with the visas and the various types of permissions for people to come into the country and to be allowed to work in the country. And then the Department of Labor. And the Department of Labor has this oversight inspection role where they are required in terms of legislation to have inspection teams that make sure that employers of any size, not just huge multinational employers or large employers across the country, employ people according to the Labour Relations Act and the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, and obviously that they meet all the other various bits of legislation, one of them being work visas. So obviously the crowd that represented unemployed individuals in South Africa, and these unemployed individuals had identified that the main reason why they were unemployed was because foreigners were being employed in their stead. And the reason why foreigners were being employed in their stead was that because, as the Minister of Labour calls them, unscrupulous employers were now employing people who, A, were illegal, so they were under the radar. When I say illegal, they didn't have work permits or whatever permissions, and one of these permissions is called the Zimbabwean exemption permit, which is the hot piece of discussion happening right now about its renewal. But they didn't have paperwork or authorization to be able to take the employer to task in terms of either the various bits of labor legislation or in terms of the CCMA, the Council for Conciliation and Mediation, or to follow any of the processes and rights accorded to them in terms of labor relations. So they could employ people, sorry, it's a long story, Martin, they could employ people at a far lower rate, lower than the minimums. So in our sector, we have a bargaining council, and that is a council where the employer and the employees, so the companies and the unions, then meet and negotiate minimums within the industry, over and above what's in the Labour Relations Act. So these would be things around maximum driving hours and sleeping out rates and rates for driving various sizes of vehicles, various cargoes, the sorts of working conditions that are required around cargoes that are dangerous to both health and et cetera, et cetera. So you had these unscrupulous employers, these companies employing people at sub-minimum rates and quite low rates. And because nothing was happening to them, the inspections weren't going ahead as they should have, because there was no action taken against them, they began to push more and more South Africans, more citizens out of those jobs, because they could now employ people who had no voice, for want of a better word. So this grouping, and there were a couple of groupings, but eventually became known as the ATDF, the All Truck Drivers Federation or Forum or Alliance. They've changed their names a couple of times, then started taking action. And one of the ways they got themselves onto the board to be noticed was to burn trucks. And unfortunately, as always, there were many innocent operators in there, members of the RFA who were caught up in these, and there were truck drivers, South African truck drivers, who were killed in this. There were some drivers who were seriously maimed. There were plenty who were traumatized. There were some companies who closed, small companies, even some big companies. Hopefully, the reason why we have this situation is now going to be addressed by the authorities. But it's taken 5 years. Call me a liar for 30 days. It's taken us 5 years. We knew what the problems were at the very beginning. I am not convinced that we now have the structures in place to deal with those companies. In our sector, we call them operators, transporters, who don't want to play by the rules. And that's the core issue, is dealing with those who don't want to play by the rules. So that's why the truck burnings happen. We've been able to keep them at bay for some time. I must admit, I am concerned that there's going to be some sort of kickback now that there's been this extension of 6 months, because I think we were all hoping that by the end of this year, this would have been resolved. We raised concerns about the process of how do you remove foreigners out of an employee in a fair, transparent, and humane process, and that hasn't really been resolved, because that is still a labor issue, and that's going to, apart from cost companies money, it's going to cost these individuals a lot, not just the loss of employment. Some of these people have been living in South Africa for 20 years. Their families have grown up here. Children go to school here. Doesn't matter whether they come from Zimbabwe or Mozambique or Malawi initially. So there are a lot of unanswered questions there. So that's that in a pumpkin shell, not a nutshell, Martin.
Thanks, that was quite comprehensive. Sandra, let me throw something at you. As you heard, I'm a sort of Maggie Thatcher person who says the only way to fix anything is privatize rail, privatize Eskom, privatize ports, privatize. If it doesn't move, or even if it does move, privatize it. Your opinion, your thoughts? I'm sure you don't necessarily align with mine.
No, I don't think it's about privatizing everything. There are many ways to look at the challenges in terms of how best to use infrastructure that we have. And a lot of the challenges that we've spoken about, they are socio-political, socio-economic challenges. We won't talk state capture even, but all of these things are linked to socio-political, socio-economic situations. So in as much as the Road Freight Association cannot stop unscrupulous operators, the railway also isn't able to prevent all the cable theft. Now, these things start to have knock-on effects, and we need to look at different ways. And I certainly don't say that privatization is the answer to everything. But we do know that the private sector gets hurt when things go wrong. We know that they have different benchmarks. We know that they often have different funding models, different incentives, and often produce a better result. But it's certainly not the answer to everything. And we also don't want a situation where you move from a state to a private monopoly. So it's finding balances in some of these weaknesses. It's finding ways to work together. It's finding ways for the roles to be properly allocated. And you spoke as well about our high tax rate. So that's not only about the high tax rate, but how those tax funds are applied, or how those tax funds are wasted. And we can plug one hole with putting everything on road, for example. And ultimately, we're going to be spending loads more money on road maintenance. We can find better ways to evacuate a whole lot of containers from a huge container ship, get them out of the port, and save the roads around the port, save the port infrastructure, save the congestion, for example. Not here to promote rail. I'm trying to say that there should be better interfaces between the infrastructure and the modes of transport, better planning, better allocation of funds, so that you look at a bigger picture in the interests of the country.
Yeah, Martin, I agree totally with what Sandra's saying, and I mean the Road Freight Association quite often in its interaction with government and even with Transnet, Freight Rail, and I can never get all the names right. I remember Spoornet, but the Ports Authority and whatever they might be, we have always said that we need to get the balance right. There will always be a place for road and there'll always be a place for rail. That there are some cargoes that we all agree should not be on the roads. They just should not be on the roads. Whether it's volumes in terms of things like ores or things, or it's over distances, we need to look at what happens around the world. And even in the most, does one say the most advanced supply chain communities around the world, you'll find that road and rail play these specific roles and they need to work in harmony. And for example, and I'm not a rail basher at all, but there are some things that either confuse me or frustrate me. So for example, if we're going to fix something, we need to fix that Natal-Gauteng corridor, the rail corridor. We need to fix it. It's got to run, 24/7. It's got to be able to take the volumes that it needs to take, because in it playing its role, it would address a couple of issues. Security issues is one of them, and I know that rail isn't secure, but that's got to be one of the things that we need to bring to that party. Then it's frequency of delivery, because there are things on trucks, not because they are trucks, it's because the client wants it on the vehicle, because they know if it goes by truck, it'll get there. So we as a country have to make sure that rail becomes a viable alternative, a secure alternative, in the roles that it must and shall and should play. And I think that's what we've got to push. That's the important thing about logistics. And I'm not a logistics fundy, please. I'm a trucker. But there are various parts of logistics that need to fit together, like a well-oiled cog on a bicycle. And right now, some of those cogs are in overdrive and others are standing still. And again, I'm not pointing fingers. What I'm saying is we've got to fix it. And then I think we've learned a heck of a lot in terms of having our derriere exposed like it happened in July. You're quite right, Martin. We've got members. We've got people who work or supply or warehouse for members who said there's no ways we're going to rebuild in KZN. Not if that's the sort of security risk that could be there. So we almost, in a way, have got an opportunity to sit down and actually get some of this right. But we need to we've been talking about it for at least 20 years, and you'll know even longer. So that's my little preach.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a whole chain. It really is a supply chain. It's the ports, it's the inland port, it's the rail, it's the control of it all. And if we get it right, it makes such a big, especially, as I said, with South Africa being isolated. So anything we push to anywhere in the world is more expensive. And Johannesburg being isolated. So it really is critical that we get this right. But I think we've waffled enough now. Tanya, can we push to get some questions that maybe, or Claire, who's handling the questions? Is there any audience left?
No, there's the audience are there. They're just very quiet.
Please,
And I did even
pump us
post in there for them to put out their thoughts and comments and
pump us
questions.
some questions. What we think, how we're going to fix things, what we're going to fix.
And I mean, to that point, and I know it's. I mean, Martin, you really spelled the scene of doom and gloom. Thanks for that.
Sorry.
But
But
we
hey, the
realistically,
lifestyle, yeah, I wouldn't leave South Africa for anything.
no, I hear you. So I mean, we do have our problems. There's no two ways about it. But at the same time, we have got our stuff. I mean, Take a Lot works. Our couriers work. We have
Yes.
product on shelves. I mean, I know, for example, in the UK, certain products they just can't get hold of. You know, they're missing kitchen towels and this, that, and the other. We have it. So I think that we are incredibly resilient. Our supply chains are resilient, despite all this drama that we have with our modes of transport and logistics. We still manage to get it done. Imagine if we did have this well-oiled machine that the Gavin is talking about, and everything works and the cogs are turning. We'd be absolutely magnificent if it could happen.
And one of the biggest growth industries in South Africa is the fruit, vegetable farming community. It's bigger than mining today. It's growing like mad, and it's so exciting that farmers can export and make money. But for farmers to export and make money, they need a port that works. You know, ideally a railway line that works.
If you see what's happening in Mpumalanga, and again, you know, a couple of weeks ago, sitting on a panel having a discussion in Mpumalanga, and I don't know if it's the Mpumalanga province that's funding this, or whether it's just SANRAL on its own, or the N4 concession. I wouldn't think it's them on their own. Have you seen the improvements that they're doing? And it's a rhetorical question, around Nelspruit heading towards and I almost use the old word for the port, Maputo and to Beira. So that side of the country, which is fruit, has said, after what's happened down in KZN, and this is one of our own provinces, we're not talking about somebody outside in the world, has said the risk of moving our product down the N3 to the port via all the truck burnings and the what's is too much. And they're upgrading that road. They're pushing a logistics pipeline through to Maputo. So you know, Tanya, as you said, we are very resilient. Martin has said it. And I think that's what we've got to focus on. We've got to focus on, and I hate the term, you know, low-hanging fruit, but we've got to fix 3 or 4 critical things. The first critical thing is our ports have to work, and we have to find out why they're not working. Is it old, antiquated equipment, or is the water too warm, or what's the story? Why are they not operating like the Rotterdams and the Shanghais? And how long will it take us to get there? Because we are losing product to our ports around us. This is a dog-eat-dog world in terms of logistics. We already have reports that some shipping lines have pulled out 1 or 2 ships out of blocks of 5 or 7. And once the ship goes, it's gone. It never comes back. So that's the first thing. We need to fix our ports. And this is my thinking, please. The second thing is in and out, the access. So like that N4 to Maputo, and getting that railway line. If that's the only railway line we fix that one that goes down to the port of Natal. That railway line was built in 1951. 1951, people. It's running 3 kilovolt DC. It's got axle mass loads or tolerances on the rails. It doesn't have passing. It has passing loops. It's not a dual line. We need to fix it. So that'd be the second thing. And then the last thing is we need to secure our routes. We can't have, you know, with all the best of intentions, people wandering into warehouses and onto routes and just disrupting it all. Those are the 3 things we've got to fix. And that's a game, a team, a country, a requirement for everyone to get involved.
No, absolutely.
I fully agree with Gavin.
I know we can't not agree with you, Gavin. So the next question is how we do it. Yeah. What do we do to make it happen? So one of the suggestions, as I said, ban the sale of copper. Boom. Like you can't buy gold, ban the sale of copper tomorrow. That will save industry gazillions. I mean, I'd hate to even think of the number. Hey, it's not just the railways, but everybody who's having their cables stolen. There's a couple of other things they can do. And as you say, is focus investment on the one route, which is Johannesburg-Durban. That's the logical one. So the first thing we need is an inland port in Gauteng. Got to have one. Because the Kazerni can never work because of crossing all the Bassa lines. And then the upgrade of the Durban port, got to happen sooner or later. And maybe an auxiliary port like Rotterdam's done, so that we don't congest the port, so that we have a way of Durban bulging out. Although there's quite a lot of land within the Durban port, which if they could just make available for the ships. We also need to dig the port out so we can get bigger ships, modernize the cranes, because they're really are getting old. Maybe privatize one or two berths, that type of thing.
Yeah. One of the things they do in Rotterdam, for example, is the way they move boxes, containers out of their port. So here in South Africa, we book a specific truck for a container. We've always done it that way. In Rotterdam, you just line up and they put the box on the first truck. The box that needs to go, or however it goes, gets onto the truck and they go. And they just load boxes onto trucks. But it's all controlled, obviously. Here, you've got to try and, tag this box to that truck who's way down that queue, or this box is hidden under there. So a couple of things like that. And if we can get that going, and the way we stage our trucks, and the way, how we move those things in and out, that is going to be a couple of those quick wins that we can actually change on an everyday basis what happens in that port or the ports.
Yeah. And a fast route into the port. They've been talking about it for a few years. That you'll have trucks that are pre-certified, like we do, say, into the big Sassels and that. So the truck is a known driver, a known truck, and you can even put up an X-ray system to triple check. I know those X-ray systems are like 300-400 million, but if we can put all that together, we can have a fast track where there's no security. You literally drive into the port and drive out. You probably get a lot more security that way than you get at the moment. So if you can put all that together, that you can get into and out of the port fast. I don't know if anybody's ever sat in those roads going into the port in Durban. Drivers can stay there for 2 days sometimes in a queue to get into the port. It's better now than it was, I must say. But it can be a nightmare. So if they can get fast into the port, fast out, fast container handling, I'm not sure the Durban port needs to be a lot bigger than it is. It just needs to be more
efficient.
Sorry,
yeah.
Can I jump in here quickly? We've got a question comment in the chat from Robert. Developing countries still face a challenge of having complete visibility of products from manufacturing up to the last consumer. Share experiences from middle-income countries that have achieved it.
Well, we have situations, or we have examples of that in this country. It's not something foreign. There are some of our large retailers that can actually see the product from the point of where it's being produced. That's not something unique. And I think that's the secret, is having visibility of your product or the goods or the amount, the volumes along the supply chains. And as I said, I'm not a supply chain expert, so please don't shoot me. But that many times is the difference between Peter and Paul. Why Paul does so well and Peter struggles. So Paul knows where to put his or her trucks or trains or warehousing space, or whatever the case may be, because they have that visibility. And now with 4IR, and South Africa is not behind. South Africa is actually at the cutting edge of many things. You've seen a couple of pictures, and I'm going to polish his marbles again, of the warehouses that Martin has built. There are warehouses here in South Africa on your doorstep that have technology that will blow your mind. It's being able to link it all together, but it's being the important thing is having those various steps in that supply chain working efficiently. And what you want to do is when a container ship docks at the port, those boxes are moved onto a train, say, for example, and shunted out up to Cater Ridge, and from there onto trucks. So you clear the port, you get those boxes out, and you get them to where there is space, to swing a cat, where you can now start fiddling with what goes where and send them to wherever they need to go. But we can, in a number of industries and products and logistics chains, we can see the product in China. We can already see what's going to come.
And that's the nice ideal, is when blockchain gets a little simpler and starts working, and you've really got a link where you can see this thing at source, where it's made in Vietnam, all the way onto containers and finally into your backyard. And there's a lot, not necessarily running through blockchain, but there's lots and lots of good software that'll do that. I mean, it's criminal, actually. All the data is there, so it's criminal not to be able to use it.
Yeah.
And a lot of guys do. On the other hand, there's a lot of guys who order something, and when it arrives at their back door and they open the container, shit, is that what we ordered? We better unload it. But I think the fewer and fewer companies like that, and more really well-organized, sophisticated. You look at our retail industry, you look at the clothing industry. I mean, those guys have got it pretty tight. They know, they source things all around the world. It comes, they label it, they get it into their stores. It's not like you can walk into any clothing store or food store, and it's on the shelf. Whether it's pharmaceuticals, I mean, gee whiz, try walking into a Discount and where they got 150,000 SKUs and the shelves are full. And they're not the only ones. So I don't think we're not bad at it.
I don't think we. Well, there's room for improvement. I just want to touch on something quickly before we kind of wrap things up here. So I mean, Gavin, I think you're part of the working group that was set up after the riots in Durban, and we touched a bit on that this morning. Jeremy was talking about the dashboard. And I think that activity has brought a lot of information to light. So it's given us a lot more information that was never available before, and created some visibility. So, I mean, if we can do that, it gives a better idea of what it is we need. Where are we slow? Where is infrastructure failing us? And once we know those things, we have a better chance of building a case to where we fix things rather than just taking a stab in the dark, so to speak. So, I mean, if they talk about infrastructure at the ports, what is needed? Do we know what's needed? Or we just kind of, waiting for government to say, okay, well, we're going to spend this amount of money, but we don't really know that that's what
Tanya, we know exactly what's needed. There's guys like Maersk or the new guys who've bought Imperial, who run ports throughout the world. These guys know exactly what a good port needs and what a good port doesn't need. I mean, the guys who now from Dubai, they run the ports in Los Angeles and Chicago and on the lakes and all of that. They know exactly what's needed. And there's been dozens of studies. I don't think there's any question about, we all know what's needed. The question is, how to get the finances, the infrastructure, and the political will to get these things done. If you can, we really don't need another strategic study to tell us what's needed. There's been so many of those. I think you could fill a building with strategic studies. And it's great for consultants, but it's not very good for anybody else. That every time you have to make a decision, you go and do another strategic study rather than make a decision. Everywhere they know in the port, they know on the rail, they know in the inland ports, they know everywhere exactly what's needed.
I think I agree with Martin there. We do know what is needed in terms of ports and rail and road, and perhaps where we are weaker is how these things fit together, how they interface, how we align capacity. So, if we have a congestion problem close to a port, we go and build another distribution center rather than working out ways to align and to integrate such that we can reduce our need for so much funding. There's no doubt we need funding, we need investment to improve the infrastructure and equipment, but it's not always about throwing money at it, and it's about me and my profit, or is it about the country and what will make South Africa competitive? So what is it that we can do to enable those linkages, to enable the touch points, to enable that capacity alignment, the spatial planning, the land use planning, and integrate all of that rather than having, go fix the port, go fix the railway, go fix the trucks, and you still don't have intermodalism. You just have all these bits and pieces without them being linked in a manner that gives you efficiencies and makes us more cost effective. I think that's what's missing.
Thank you, Sandra.
But I also think you need to make the components work. So it's the integration of the components, but the components as well. And if you can get the integration and the components working, well, we're cooking.
Tanya,
I think,
did we answer that one question we got?
Yeah, no, I think that that you did. Yeah, no, I think that we did. No, that's the important thing. I think that, this is a conversation that, could go on for days. I mean, it's highly topical and there's lots that needs to be said about it. But, we can't, Rome wasn't built in a day and we can't solve all our problems at once. So I think that we need to kind of, go away and think about these things and what could be done and who can do it, and how we can make a difference. So I really want to thank you guys for your time, your participation, your insights, your thoughts, and your valuable contributions to this topic for our audience. We are very grateful for your time because I know that you're all very busy. You have lots to do. Gavin, you are always, I think you're on the radio and the TV more than you are anything else at the moment, fighting fires.
I'm sorry.
But we're grateful that you're there to provide the support and the update. So thank you to our panel here for all that you've given to this conversation.